Hello! How's everyone doing? Wanted to do a video on Japanese progressive rock. Obviously, Japan is all the rage with the weeaboo culture and the YouTube algorithm doing its thing. You hear a lot about Japanese fusion nowadays, like Cassiopeia have become surprisingly popular. You hear a lot about Japanese video game composers, and obviously, it's widely acknowledged that all of your favorite Nintendo and Sega music from the 90s is heavily influenced by bands like ELP, Genesis, Yes, and so on, but you don't hear a lot about Japanese progressive rock itself. In fact, it's almost redundant to title this video Japanese prog rock hidden gems because, in terms of popularity, most of this stuff is already ranked below. Obviously, the great UK scene, the Italian scene, even the Quebec scene seems to be a lot more popular. One reason is Japan was surprisingly late to the prog game. Although they had a jazz and jazz fusion scene alongside the rest of the world when that stuff was popular in America and Europe as well. It's not necessarily that Japan was late to the prog game as a whole, but their brand of prog rock in the early to mid 70s was generally more rooted in heavy psych and psychedelic rock, often bluesier in nature than stuff like Genesis and Yes or Gentle Giant. Despite the fact that bands like ELP were hugely popular in the country, Japan didn't really seem to catch the symphonic bug until the later portion of the 1970s, with the band Shin Jetsu largely being regarded as the first full-on symphonic prog band from Japan. By the way, I'm going to preemptively apologize for any mispronounced or poorly pronounced Japanese in this video. I'm just, a hillbilly from the South who happens to dig this shit. So I'll be listing the names of all the albums I cover in the description anyway. Anyway, Shingetsu didn't release a full length until 1979. Now, if you know your rock history, prog rock was not exactly at the top in 1979. You hear 1979, you might be thinking punk, new wave, no wave, jazz fusion, AOR, yacht rock, arena rock. You might be thinking of the growing, hard rock and heavy metal scene at the time, but probably not prog rock. Most of the big name prog groups of the 70s were either fizzling out or adopting a more pop oriented sound. We all know about ELP, Love Beach, and all that stuff. Shingetsu's self-titled 79 album, on the other hand, almost exists entirely in a world where music stopped being made after, like, selling England by the pound, basically. It's almost a bit too laid back and pastoral for its own good, although I do think it's a decent record with a lot of Steve Hackett worship coming from the guitar player. I'm mainly mentioning it in this video because it's pretty much the first of its kind as far as I'm aware, but I would, as far as quality, I'd follow it under enthusiasts only. But in the wake of Shingetsu, you had similarly symphonic, heavily 70s influenced bands popping up in Japan all throughout the 1980s, which is what this list will be focusing on primarily. The scene pressed on, but never quite gained its footing commercially. A lot of these bands sound simultaneously of their time, but also 10 years behind their time in some aspects, whereas the full on uh, neo prog sounds coming from Europe, like Marillion and IQ, those bands seem to be a lot more cognizant of 80s pop norms. Um, you don't really find much of that in the Japanese straight prog scene, although there are some exceptions where some bands took a more neo prog sound, like Midas with their 1988 Beyond the Clear Air album. And now there are also bands like Ruins who were leaning more into noise and punk territory, and progressive metal bands like Doom who had a strong voivod sound. But this list is pretty much focused on bands that had more of an affinity for the established 70s prog tropes. All these bands have keyboard players and long, long songs and stuff like that. So, first officially on the list is B. Kyo Ran with their self-titled 1982 album. These guys are interesting. They apparently formed in '73, but didn't release a full length until 9 years later. And man, I think if this had come out in the mid '70s, I think more people would know about it. Whereas others in the Japanese scene were more enamored with Genesis and Yes and these symphonic, pastoral kind of soundscapes, Kyo Ran are an obvious attempt at recreating the John Wetton, Bill Bruford era of King Crimson. It's fairly dark and heavy at times. There's some pretty obvious similarities to Rush's heavier material. Even some guitar playing that reminds me of what Voivod would be doing years later on albums like Nothing Face. However, nothing here really crosses into metal territory at all. There's a firm 70s grounding to all this. Main problem with Kyo Ran for me is much like with most of the Japanese prog groups, there's a pretty strict adherence to a relatively straight style of playing, you know. So while the influence of an album like Lark's Tongues and Aspic or Red is undeniably here, um, Kyo Ran play with more of the discipline and grace of a band like Genesis, so they never quite tap into the chaotic atmosphere, the almost like claustrophobic nature of Crimson's 73, 74 material. Vocals are also pretty melodramatic, so that also kind of separates it from Crimson, but still a really enjoyable record, and it's definitely worth checking out. Up next is a weird one, Katra Turana, with their self-titled 1982 album. Now, it seems like every major prog movement from the 70s had at least one Japanese, I don't want to say imitator, but I'll say at least one Japanese spawn in its wake. And if Kyo Ran was Japan's answer to King Crimson, then I'd say Katra Tirana or Japan's take on like the Avant prog, drawing some very obvious inspiration from the RIO or rock in opposition movement of bands like Henry Cow, Universe Zero, stuff like that. There is still an undercurrent of like symphonic grace to this music, much like most of the Japanese prog of the time. It's got elements of chamber music, and the vocals are crazy. I mean, they initially sound like a man and a woman. It's actually just one person doing both. The femme vocals can get a little ridiculous, even for my taste, but this is such a weird ass record. I gotta recommend it anyway. Next on the list, getting back to more normal sounding territory, Terutsugu Hirayama with his 1983 album Castle of Noi. Noi, Noi. This is unabashed symphonic prog with a woman on vocals who sounds great. Honestly, she's good enough that she probably could have made a whole lot more money singing the far more popular city pop genre that was, huge in Japan at the time. So Terutsugu Hirayama was a member of Novella, another very good symphonic prog group that hit the scene around the same time as Shingetsu. Now, while Novella had some hard rock leanings similar to Deep Purple or Uriah Heep, Hirayama's Castle of Noi album is just full on medievalist fantasy world symphonic shit, right down to the album cover that looks like some sort of anime or manga type painting. You kind of know what you're getting with this. Really upbeat, majestic, heavily Genesis inspired, and kind of reminds me of video game music as well. Now, speaking of video game music, last album I want to mention in this video is Ars Nova's 1992 release, Fear and Anxiety. All right, so this band is three women, bass, drums, and keyboards, just like ELP, except, that was three dudes playing. These girls are playing heavily ELP inspired material that really wouldn't sound out of place in like a Super Nintendo RPG. It's like straight up Final Fantasy boss music, So if you're into that sort of thing, I highly recommend it. Uh, I mean, this album was released in 92, but if you told me it came out in 1973 and I didn't know what it was, I'd believe you. I'd be like, okay, 73. Uh, all right. So, as always, this is not a comprehensive list and just some random gems I don't see getting talked about very often. Wanted to shine light on a prog rock scene that doesn't really get talked about as much as the others. There are some others I wanted to cover here. And there were some bands I wanted to talk about, but that maybe blurred a bit too much into jazz fusion territory, like the other all woman group Cosmos, really great band. So I might do a video on Japanese jazz fusion of this era later. Of course, feel free to recommend other albums in the comments, as well as your thoughts on the albums I covered. I will be listing everything I talked about in the description, so you can look all these guys up on Prog Archives, YouTube, so you can hear the music, rate your music, that whole thing. So thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe.